On main news this morning, ambulance workers and firefighters could be banned from going on strike under plans which are being considered by the government to reduce the impact of industrial action. But any legislation wouldn't go before MPs until next month. It comes as a wave of strikes over Christmas is expected to bring widespread disruption.
Unions have written to the Chancellor this morning demanding the government engages in meaningful pay talks to help people struggling to cope with the cost of living. Nurses, paramedics, Royal Mail and rail staff, of course, are among the millions of workers that are due to strike over the next couple of months. Our political correspondent, Louisa James, is at Westminster for us this morning. Morning, Louisa. So Rishi Sunak saying that he's determined to keep the public safe and stop lives being disrupted.
Yeah, and I think it is a definite change in tone from the Prime Minister and from Number 10. Only on Tuesday, when we had the daily briefing of journalists and there were lots of questions about strikes, Number 10 said there were no plans to change the law beyond what is already being worked on by ministers to ensure that there is a minimum service level by transport workers during strikes. But it now looks as though the plan may be to extend those laws to public sector workers, including perhaps the emergency services. And when they were asked whether that could mean some workers being banned from striking altogether, Number 10 are now saying that nothing is being ruled out. Now, the unions are defiant. They say they won't be intimidated by this. They are ready for it financially and industrially. But I think the calculation from Number 10 is that they no longer want to be seen to be presiding over the country descending into chaos. And I think the other calculation is that with such widespread disruption now planned for Christmas, that after 2 years of COVID as well, they are wondering whether the tide of public sympathy may be turning. The latest front line in the public sector pay battle, the UK border. Passport control staff at 6 airports are expected to walk out over 8 days between the 23rd of December and New Year's Eve, adding to the wave of industrial action already happening over Christmas.
I would expect people to be angry. You know, I make the point that the majority of people we're representing are worrying about feeding their family and buying Christmas presents. There's no point taking industrial action when nobody notices.
But ministers certainly have noticed, and they want to stamp it out.
If union leaders are not going to be reasonable, then my priority is always going to be to protect people's safety and to minimise the disruption on their day-to-day lives, and I will do whatever I need to do to ensure that that's what we can make happen.
Making that happen could mean making new laws. To avoid scenes like this, the government was already considering making public transport workers provide a minimum level of service during strikes. Now, with nurses and paramedics set to walk out, ministers could widen those rules to include the emergency services too, especially if they don't make concessions on what emergencies they'll deal with during strike action. Unions say they're ready to fight measures like that, but have also written to the Chancellor calling for meaningful talks on pay increases.
Inflation plus 5% is not a sum that I would be able to afford if I were Health Secretary today. But we've got to get the nurses and the ambulance workers and other NHS staff around the table. The message I've been getting from the unions is that there is a deal to be done.
Any new laws curbing strikes are unlikely to get off the ground before well into the new year. So if negotiations don't fly, it looks like many of us won't either. Louisa James, Good Morning Britain.
That's our main news. We will be speaking to Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, to ask her what a potential Labour government would do in this situation. So joining us now, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Very good morning to you.
Good morning.
You must have sympathy with people who think, right, I can't get on a train to see my family. Hospitality workers who think, well, we've lost a whole load of money, which is going to get us through the next year. Now we know we can't get sick on the 15th and the 20th because the nurses are going to strike. You don't need to call an ambulance on the 21st or the 28th because those workers are going on strike. And now anyone hoping to get away and leave the country altogether has been told that Border Force staff are walking out. Is this sort of the equivalent of a general strike? What's going on with the unions?
Well, the first thing I would say is it's not just on strike days that things aren't working. It's every single day of the week. You know, pick up any newspaper today and you'll see stories about people waiting for hours and hours and hours in A&E. You'll see stories about people waiting for many hours to get an ambulance, but people waiting for months and months to get an operation. And as for trains, you know, anybody that uses our train network has experienced recently delays. In my own constituency in Leeds, there were no trains for an hour during rush hour from the train station in my constituency into town. So this
those
isn't just a
services
strike
already
issue.
aren't working
They're
properly.
on their knees.
But how do the strikes help?
Well, they're obviously not going to help. They're a last resort, though, for workers who are crying out for support from government. We had a vote in Parliament this week about whether to keep the non-dom tax status. It costs us £3 billion a year. Labour said that should be abolished and we should use it to have one of the biggest ever expansions of the workforce in the NHS. Labour voted for that, Tories voted against it. No wonder people in our NHS are getting sick and tired of hearing the government say you've got to do more and more and more, but where's the cavalry? The cavalry aren't coming with the Tories.
Labour's
There's no investment.
I think people are interested. You, of course, are ahead in the polls. If a general election was held now, you'd probably sweep the board. But what would you do? Because we've already heard Wes Streeting say, for instance, on the nurses' pay, inflation plus 5% is not a sum I'd be able to afford if I was Health Secretary.
Well, I think the first thing is that these strikes aren't just about pay. They're also about workload. It's about the shortages in our health service, and that's true in other public services as well. You know, these key workers were people who we were standing with our pots and pans on our doorsteps and applauding, and now they're asking to be treated fairly. They're struggling, like other workers, with the cost of living crisis.
But at the heart, it's about wages.
Well,
so
actually,
would you pay
yeah.
the wage increases that these workers are asking for?
We would negotiate. You know, whether you could afford that increase straight away, I'm not convinced about that. But this isn't just about pay. You know, this is about...
Would you give them any sort of pay rise?
Just say, this is about the nurse at the end of her shift who can't go home. Can't go home because no one is there to take over from her. You know, this is a nightmare for people working in the NHS.
So you pay workers more money in order to retain workers and attract more workers, for instance, in the NHS. So are you saying that in order to do retention and recruitment, you would pay people more? Because that's what you're suggesting, if the nurse can't go home because there's no one to take over the shift.
But what I said is this week we voted to have a big expansion of the workforce, double the number of medical school places, increase the training places for midwives, for district nurses, because at the heart of this, there is a real problem. The biggest problem...
So expand the workforce but not pay more.
Well, the biggest
problem... I think these workers in particular, and obviously they're represented by unions who contribute to you, to other members of the...
Actually, with the RCN and with the RMT, that's
no,
not
but the
GMB,
the Unite and Unison.
Well, some of them are affiliated and
yes.
some aren't.
Okay.
But
so they'll want
the ones you're talking about, the nurses, they're not affiliated.
But the ambulance
to the
workers,
Party.
union is affiliated, right?
Yeah.
And would you pay ambulance workers more?
Look, I've said that everything in our manifesto will be fully costed and fully funded. That is really important because we've seen with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, when they announced stuff and didn't say where the money was going to come from, that crashed the economy. But when we had a Labour government last, we did not have these strikes by public sector workers because we treated them with dignity and respect.
Sorry, but just to go back, so GMB, Unite and Unison, right, all affiliated with the Labour Party, right?
Yeah, and we're proud to be
and so my point
that
is,
relationship with Labour is the party
unions,
of working people.
Many of whose workers are out on strike or going to be on strike this month, want to know, will you give them a pay rise?
That's not the only thing that they want to know.
I know it's not the only thing, Rachel Reeves,
I'm not going to pluck money. You know, I'm not going to pluck money and pluck numbers out of
You must have been talking with everybody.
We don't know what we're going to inherit. Every time the Chancellor gets up...
What do we realistically believe we could afford if we were in position?
Right, so the election's probably going to be in a couple of years' time. We don't know what the fiscal inheritance is going to be. We know that the government have made a mess of our public services and made a mess of our public finances. That does mean that Labour won't be able to do everything everything we want as quickly as possible. But we would treat these workers with respect. We would get down, negotiate with them. We would expand the people working in the health service, so the pressure, the workload pressures that nurses, ambulance drivers, etc. are under are not so acute. And I would say, look at our record. When we were in government, we did not have this industrial action because we treated those workers with the dignity and respect.
The government argue that we've been through an
Tories.
unprecedented pandemic. We've had the fallout from Brexit. I mean, there's a huge number of elements that are involved in this economic situation where we are now.
But even before the pandemic, the waiting lists were rising and rising. And the other key thing, and this is what I'm speaking about today at this business conference that Labour are hosting in Canary Wharf, that the economy has barely grown for the last decade or so, an average growth rate of 1.4% a year. Under the last Labour government, the average growth rate was 1.5 times higher than that at 2.1%. We need to grow our economy because that is the way to improve people's living standards and have the money to invest in our public services, which is why we're making announcements today about how to make Britain the best place to start and grow a business, to create the wealth and the prosperity, so we've got the money for public services that we need.
Lots of people would say that maybe what Labour should try and do is try and overturn Brexit. The Office of Budget Responsibility said that there's a significant adverse impact on UK trade is what has happened post-Brexit. £100 billion a year hit to prosperity. Mark Carney said, put it this way, in 2016, the British economy was 90% of the size of Germany's. Now it is less than 70%. It's had huge impact that you know, sort of the majority of people that voted Remain stand by their decision to vote Remain. And lots of people who've said they wanted to leave are suddenly going, actually, this has caused far more trauma than we ever thought it was going to happen. Is that something that you would look at trying to ameliorate, trying to improve, maybe roll back on some of those conditions?
We want to improve the deal that the government has done because there's massive holes in it. So for the service sector of the economy, for example, which is more than 80% of the UK economy, there is no deal at all in services. If you look at, for example, at agriculture, there's no veterinary deal, which is causing huge delays and backlogs at the borders. For our fantastic creative industries, which is a great British success story, our creative artists can't go touring around Europe without a load of bureaucracy. So there are things that we want to do to improve upon the deal that we've got today. We're not going to go back into the EU or the single market or reintroduce freedom of movement, but we're not happy with the status quo. It's clearly not working, especially for smaller businesses, many of whom have just stopped exporting altogether because the costs of it and the bureaucracy of it is just too high.
You are absolutely ruling out like a Swiss-style deal or a freedom of movement.
Well, the Swiss have got freedom of movement, and we've said no freedom of movement, no single market, no customs union. But the status quo is not working for British business or for British workers. We would improve upon what we've got to give that boost to our economy, to jobs and prosperity. Because at the end, none of these issues can be resolved, whether it is improving pay for public sector workers, whether it is tackling the cost of living crisis, whether making this the best place to start and grow a business without economic growth. And that is going to be the heart of Labour's offer at the next election, pro-business and pro-worker, recognising that the success of each is dependent on the other.
Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor, good to see you in the studio this morning. Thank you very much.
Lovely to be here.
Thanks for joining us.